Good evening, cycle breakers. You know who I am, Pastor C, back with another cycle breaking Monday. And I'm grateful to have you here with me. Cycle Breakers for Life exists to help you break out of negative cycles and move into positive seasons of your life. We want to keep those positive cycles going and flowing in our lives, but it's the negative ones that we need to literally replace. So, thank you so much for coming in tonight, for taking time out of your day to be here with us. We are in week 9 of our series, MMB Shift, Align, and Execute. And we have been digging deep. I'm telling you, we have been covering some ground concerning minding our business, minding my business, minding your business, so that we can shift, so we can align, and we can execute those things that God has placed in our hands, in our heart, so that we can be a blessing to the communities that we live in. I mean, gosh, we exist to fulfill the plan of God, to carry out His mission here in the earth. And there are so many people that need what you carry, and that's why I think this burden has been really, really deep for me, because I realized that I can't be selfish with my gifts, can't be selfish with my time. So thank you so much as you all are popping in here tonight. I see my sister, my friend, my cousin, Dee Dee here tonight. Thank you so much for coming in tonight, Dee. I appreciate you. Busy lady, blessed lady. She just started her own business, two businesses actually. And we're so grateful because she is shifting, she's aligning, and she's executing the things that God put in her hands. And she's not the only one. You have something valuable that God has placed in your life. And hopefully, this session tonight will help you to move further in what God has for you. Okay. Now, look, cycle breakers, if we just take a moment and remember where we've been, because this journey here tonight is progressive, and nothing we're doing here tonight is accidental. We've talked about minding your mantle, learning how to release what God never assigned and put down, unauthorized weight. We dealt with alignment before acceleration. That's where we understood that God often repositions us before He releases provision. And if you've been honest with yourself, you probably realized something last week. Clarity is not the issue, alignment is not the issue. The real issue is execution. Because alignment without movement, it becomes frustration. And revelation without response becomes responsibility. And that's why tonight is a turning point. Tonight, we're talking about something that sounds good, feels spiritual, and gets a lot of amens, but often lacks understanding. We're talking about shift, SHIFT. So drop it in the chat, shift. Just type the word shift. Because the truth is, many people love to say they're shifting, but don't understand what shifting actually requires. So tonight's message is called Execute or Expire. Faith that stays in your head will die there. We love to say things like, I'm shifting, this is my shift season. I feel a shift, right? And it sounds powerful. It sounds prophetic. It sounds exciting. But let me slow this down, because shift is not about a feeling. Shift means that your position has changed. In the natural, when you shift gears in a car, the car does not stay where it is, right? Power transfers, the engine adjusts, and movement changes. And if you keep pressing the gas without shifting, guess what? You're going to burn out the engine. So some of you are spiritually exhausted, not because you're doing too much, but because you're pressing forward without changing your position. All right. So a shift always requires movement. Remember that, a shift. When God is shifting you, it requires movement. It requires a decision. It requires obedience. It requires action. So when you say, I'm shifting, what you're really declaring is, I'm leaving one position and I'm stepping into another. And that is where most people get stuck, because changing position, hear me clearly, changing position, it costs you something. So when you say, I'm shifting, what you're really saying is, I'm moving out of out of this position into another position. And that movement, moving from one position to another position, it costs something. Okay. So let me say this plainly, and I want to say it very lovingly. Good intentions do not move you into where God is taking you. You can have good intentions, right? But it's not necessarily going to take you where God is wants to take you. obedient action does. All right. So we have a generation of cycle breakers who are informed, they're inspired and intentional, but inactive. We know the word, we agree with God, we understand the concept, but execution keeps getting postponed. In James 1:22, verse 22, it tells us, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. That word deceiving, it matters. It means we can convince ourselves, that we're faithful simply because we believe without ever moving. We just so convinced that I'm faithful, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But when God gives you something, you're not moving because you're not believing it for yourself. Agreement in itself is not obedience. Okay. Understanding in itself is not execution. And excitement by itself, it's not implementation. Faith that stays in your head, it's going to expire there. So when we say faith that stays in your head will expire there, I'm talking about what happens when belief about what happens when you believe it never becomes movement. Faith was never designed to live only in your thoughts. Faith was designed to move your life. All right. Many people believe the right things. They agree with God. They understand the scriptures. They feel inspired when they hear truth, but nothing changes. Do you wonder why? Type in the chat, why? Why? As I want to tell you why. I want to dig deep and I want to let you know why. Why they agree with God, why they understand the scriptures, why they feel inspired and when they hear the truth, but nothing changes. Type it in the chat. Why? Because I want to tell you why. Well, thank you, Adrian. I appreciate you. Good to see you tonight because faith never left their head. Faith never left their head. It never reached their hands. It never reached their feet, their decisions, their schedule, or their obedience. You know, I was doing some searching and I realized that the word expire means something that has reached the end of its youthful life. Woo, expire. Something that has reached the end of its youthful life. It loses its strength, it loses its effect, it becomes inactive. And that's exactly what happens to faith when it never turns into action. At first, the faith is strong. I mean, you hear God speak and it feels clear. You feel the conviction that goes with it. You feel the courage to get up and run with it. You feel the urgency that has to be done now. But if you keep delaying movement, something begins to happen. And guess what? The urgency begins to fade. The clarity weakens and the courage shrinks. Not because God changed his mind, but because unused faith begins to lose its momentum. All right? James 2:17 says, "Faith without works is dead." Faith without works is dead. Now notice the language. Dead faith is not faith that didn't believe. Dead faith is faith that never moved. The belief was real, but the response was it just never happened. So the faith expired in the mind. It stayed an idea. It stayed a prayer. It stayed a plan on paper. It stayed with the thought, one day I'm going to do that, right? But faith was never meant to live as a theatrical agreement or a theoretical agreement or a once in a lifetime agreement. Faith is meant to become practical obedience. And that's why in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, it never celebrates people who simply believed. It celebrated people who moved. It says that by faith, Noah built an ark. Can you imagine building an ark back then that would never rained, but God told him what to do, gave him the specs on the ark, told him, what to use to build it, excuse me, even told him what to put inside of it. And people thought he was crazy. But by faith, Noah built the ark. By faith, Abraham moved when God told him to move, right? By faith, Moses confronted Pharaoh. You know, I mean, the children of Israel had been in bondage for years. And here God speaks to Moses from a burning bush, which is a miracle in itself, and tells him, to tell Pharaoh to let my people go and tell him I am sent you, right? And even though Moses had all these excuses as to why he shouldn't go, even down to his speech impediment, God provided for him to carry out that mission. And Moses had a choice. Moses had to decide to move, to do what God said. So by faith, Moses confronted Israel. By faith, Rahab acted. Faith always produces movement. You hear me? Faith always produces movement. So when we say tonight, execute or expire, we're not threatening faith, right? Or I'm not threatening your faith. We're explaining a spiritual reality. If you keep postponing what God told you to do, eventually the conviction that you feel from God that this has to be done, it's going to weaken. And the window of the courage that you had when he first spoke it to you is going to narrow. And the opportunity to move, it begins to fade. Not because God removed the assignment. No, but because your faith was never exercised. That's why sometimes we look up, and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, or maybe last week. We look up sometimes when God tells us to do something, because see, when God has a plan, he's got people to reach, he's got people to deliver, people to save, people to set free, bondages that need to be broken. Um, and so he's got a plan. And when we give God all these excuses, we get fired up, excited to move with the vision that God has. To move with what God is saying. We get that courage, that little rush of adrenaline to do what God said. We get excited, but then we're confronted with the responsibility of the task, and then we start weakening. And before we know it, we look up and somebody else is doing what God told us to do. Why? Because the plan of God is going to move with us or without us. And that's what you have to understand. God always has a backup plan. He knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows that some of us, we're going to get so excited over the thing that all of our energy is going to go into the excitement. And you know what? This is what's dangerous. When God gives us something to do and we repeat what God said to 5 and 6 and 7, 8, 9, 10 people. Well, by the time you share it to all the people, all your excitement went to telling them what God was going to do through you before you even sat down with God to find out what to do, how to do it, when to do it. So, I shared that, briefly because we wonder why it is that some people, can set their mind to do something and they carry it out. And other people, hear from God and they never do anything. That's why I wrote The Other Side of Done, because I realized that I'm surrounded sometimes by people, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's on my job, whether it's in my church, whether it's in different networks that I'm connected to, that there are people with great ideas from God, but they never see those things come into fruition because they've not exercised the other side of done, the doing phase. And after you've done it, the did phase, making sure that thing is secure to the point that you're leaving legacy. Oh my God, this book is filled with things to help you to not just think about the thing that God is telling you, but to carry it out, to see it through, and then to fix it to the point that somebody else will pick up and run with it. You hear me what I'm saying tonight, right? So, if you're getting this, say, I'm getting it, Pastor C. All right. So you're missing what God is saying because your faith was never exercised in the realm of what God is telling you to do it. So think of faith like a muscle. If you use it, it grows, right? If you ignore it, it becomes weaker. That's why execution matters. Oh my gosh, execution is the moment when faith leaves your head and enters into your life. Execution is when belief becomes a behavior, it becomes second nature to you. Revelation becomes a response, and intention becomes obedience. You hear God, you intend to do it, but you get up and you run with it. That's the turning point. And that is why tonight matters, because some of you are not lacking faith. No, you're simply standing at the moment where faith must move. You're at what I call the strategic inflection point. It's that point where either you'll move or you don't move. It's that point where you have to decide, am I willing to go all the way, or am I going to stand at the edge of the water and never swim, never see if I can actually accomplish what God told me? It's when faith moves, the cycles break. You hear me? When you start moving in spite of your fear, moving instead of your doubt, and in spite of your doubt, moving in regardless of the stress or the anxiety, just knowing that this is something that God put in your hands to do, the book, the business, the entrepreneurship. I mean, if I could just open the mic and just let Evangelist Debbie share, her testimony, that would just be awesome, because someone needs to hear, what she did in order to have the dream of having her own care facility, to actually moving in the direction of actually getting her LLC, actually coming to a place where she can hire people to work for her, to the point that she can work that business and be at home, right? I mean, it takes guts. It takes a motivation, but God never gives you an assignment that He does not give you the supply to carry it out. You hear me what I'm saying? He never gives you an assignment and doesn't give you what you need to carry out that assignment. So why are you hesitating? Why are you refusing? You're going to execute, or you're going to expire. The dream is going to expire. It's going to come to a place where it no longer works. I knew a young man once who was told by his pastor, I want you to be a deacon in the church. And he knew he had a call in his life to be a pastor. He knew he had a call in his life to do more. But he told his pastor, I'm not no deacon. God didn't call me to be no deacon. He called me to be a pastor. So the pastor respected him and said, okay, do what God tells you to do, right? About a year later, this young man comes back to him and says, I'm ready to be a deacon now. Because being a pastor, he wasn't ready for it. He wasn't ready for serving people. He wasn't ready for the challenges that came with being a pastor. He wasn't ready for the ups and downs of ministry. He wasn't ready for shepherding people with different identities and different characteristics and different needs and different wants. He wasn't ready for that. So he comes back and he says, Pastor, I'm ready to be a deacon. He says, I'm sorry, you missed the time to be a deacon. You're a pastor now. So whatever lessons he was supposed to learn in that stage as a deacon, he missed it. And now he had to tough it out. You know, what am I saying? I'm saying that when God gives you specific instructions, it may not be the point that you want to reach yet, but He'll give you little incremental steps to get to where He wants you to go. So the point is, you need to execute. No matter how minute it looks, how small that step looks, you need to do what God says. If the Lord is telling you, maybe you want to write a book, but He's telling you, you feel impressed to just start writing in a journal, and you say, I don't like the journal, right? I don't like all that, right? But the Spirit of God is telling you, get you a journal, get you a pen. Every time you come into my presence, I want you to bring a journal, bring a pen, bring a journal, bring a pen. And to you, that sounds like, "Oh, I'm just going to write the book." But there's something you need to be learning while you're journaling. You're learning consistency. You're learning faithfulness. You're learning how to express yourself without bleeding on people. You're learning how to get your thoughts in order. You're learning how to go back and look back through the journal and see where you were going through specific tests and specific challenges. Maybe the chapters of the book are in your journal writing, but because you refuse to do what God told you to do in the one step, you're gonna miss God entirely. So I hope you hear me what I'm saying tonight. When faith moves, cycles of instability, cycles of self-sabotage, cycles of limiting beliefs, cycles of negative mindsets, cycles break when your faith moves. So let me tell you, um, something, and I really want to talk to the real world for a moment. I mean, I'm talking about, when I say real, I'm talking about your positions, your titles, the things that you do, how you show up in the world, parents, entrepreneurs, CEOs, leaders, ministry builders. You need to know that delayed obedience doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like I'm being responsible. Sometimes it looks like I'm just being cautious. Sometimes it looks like I'm being spiritual, and it sounds like I'm still preparing. I just need one more confirmation. I'm going to do that thing when things settle down. Uh, this isn't the right season for that. Sound familiar? Ecclesiastes 11:4 tells us, he who he who observes the wind will not sow. All right. In other words, if you keep waiting for perfect conditions, you'll never move. Execution requires courage, not certainty. Okay. So some of you are treating God's word like it has an expiration date, and it doesn't. Hebrews 2 and 3 says, though the vision tarry, wait for it because it will surely come. Now, waiting doesn't mean standing still. And that's what some of us think. God told me to wait. And I've even heard people say, I'm in my waiting season. Um, Girl, I haven't seen you, in a long time. I'm in my waiting season. I haven't seen you at church for a long time. I'm in my waiting season. God just told me to wait, right? Um, I heard that you were, doing podcasts and it was good. And you're working towards having your own YouTube channel. I haven't seen you doing a podcast lately. I'm in my waiting season. So let me tell you what I'm saying. Waiting means remaining faithful while you're still moving. Waiting means remaining faithful while you're still moving, right? I'm going to write a book, right? I haven't published a book. I haven't written the book yet. I haven't done this, but I am in God's presence. I am every 20 minutes, dedicating 20 minutes a day out of just writing, right? I'm getting ready. I'm still moving, right? It hasn't come into fruition yet, right? I haven't gotten a job yet, but I am on Indeed. I am, in LinkedIn. I am in certain places and I'm putting in applications, right? I'm in my waiting season. I'm still waiting for the job to come, but I am moving, right? I'm still doing something. I believe God. Faith without works is dead, right? I want to be a good parent and I have anger issue. I'm not saying myself. I'm just using an example because my kids are grown, right? I want to be a good parent, but I have anger issues. So, while you're waiting for God to perfect that right attitude in you, why not join a support group? Right? Why not get some counseling? You're working on it. You see what I'm saying? Waiting means remaining faithful while you're still moving, while you're still exercising your faith. I believe that God's going to do it. So your action comes into unity with what God is going to do. You just don't show up in a finished place and be perfected. There are steps to perfection. There are things you have to do to be perfected, right? Old habits die hard, right? You've been used to certain things for years. So when you confront them, it takes time to literally eliminate that thing, okay? So um waiting means remaining faithful while you move. So what God spoke last season, it still requires action this season. I told you all when I lost my job, and I was at my wit's end, was depressed, and I didn't think I could make it. I just felt like, oh my God, half of our house income comes from my salary. What are we going to do? How are we going to make it? I feel like a failure. I messed up. I blew it. And I sought God. I said, Lord, what do you want me to do in this season? Because I'm not doing good. I told God, I talked to my mom, I shared with her how I was feeling. She ministered to me. I talked to my husband. He told me to go to the gym. I went to the gym. And in the midst of going to the gym in those pool exercises, I just started releasing some of the stress, some of the anxiety. What was I doing? I was exercising my faith. I knew God didn't put me in this season to die. I just knew that somehow my faith was rooted in him, even though my emotions were rooted in my flesh. I knew that God still loved me. Right. And so I said, God, what do you want me to do in this season? He said 3 words. He said, right, 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 right. He told me that at the end of 2019, going into 2020. And I'm a 9-time published author, not to any glory of my own. I don't say that to praise myself. I don't say that because writing has been my lifeline. And I never knew that God had anointed me to be an author. I never knew that God had anointed. I love to teach, but I never knew that God would give me how to write classes and master classes and workshops, which is what I do. And I love doing it. That's why Cycle Breakers for Life exists. Out of those 3 words, right, right, right. There was no Cycle Breakers for Life before that command. But when I did it and I showed up, I was consistent in days that I didn't feel like showing up. I didn't feel like being on a live. I was scared to death of being on lives, in the beginning, right? And even now I get a little nervous. Even now the computer glitches and I just it makes me all flabbergasted, all that kind of stuff. But now I'm more seasoned because I did what God told me to do first. And I want to tell you all, some of you, the reason why you're stuck is because you haven't done the first thing God told you. Or some of you are stuck because what he told you to do is still sitting in a journal, or it's still sitting on a notepad, or it's sitting on a sticky note, or it's sitting in your mind, and you're not doing it. So you want to know you're saying, God, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? Go back to what he told you last. That's wisdom dropping right in your corner, right? Go back to what he told you to do last. What you heard him to say, you heard him to say to you so profoundly that you knew it was God. Go back to that. Ask God for mercy. Ask God for grace. Pick it up and ask God to breathe on it again. I just want to stop and just ask the Lord to breathe on your visions, to breathe on your dreams, to breathe on what He spoke to you, to bring it alive again. You hear me? Because if you don't execute those things, they will expire. There is an expiration date. All right. Just because time passed, though, it doesn't mean that the assignment has expired. God will use somebody else. He'll use a child. He'll use anybody that is willing to do it. But God wants you first. He wants you. You know, you're His daughter, you're His son, and He wants to use you more than you ever thought you could be used by God. So, unused faith, it weakens. Unexercised obedience is like a muscle that's not used, it atrophies. And faith that is never acted on eventually dies. So here's the truth we avoid. Every shift has a cost. Shifting costs you familiarity, things that you're familiar with. Shifting costs you your comfort zone. Shifting costs you control, releasing that control to God. And that's why many people stay stuck, not because they don't know better, but because movement demands something from them. For parents, execution looks like changing patterns, not just praying outcomes. For entrepreneurs, for those of you that are entrepreneurs, execution looks like launching, adjusting, and risking. For leaders, execution looks like hard conversations and realignment. And for those of you in ministry that are leaders, execution looks like obedience without applause. So here's the shift for tonight. We want to go from intention to implementation. Okay? Intentions sound spiritual. Implementation, it produces fruit. Intentions live in your prayer, but implementation lives in action. Intention says one day, but implementation says today. And some of you are exhausted because you keep rehearsing obedience instead of practicing it. You know, Hebrews 11 doesn't celebrate the thinkers. Remember, I told you Noah, Abraham, Moses, Rahab. Faith always has evidence throughout scripture. God rarely changes the circumstances before He changes position. Abraham had to leave. Ruth had to move before provision met her in the field. Elijah had to shift locations when the brook dried up. Even Jesus changed regions as assignments shifted. So God often changes where you stand before He changes what you see. So if you haven't moved yet, the question isn't always, why hasn't God answered? Sometimes the real question is, why haven't I shifted? If there's no movement, faith is theoretical, not transformational. So let me be your sideline cheerleader and your coach right now. I'm proud of your awareness. I'm proud of your growth, but I will not let you stop here. You didn't survive what you survived to stall now. You didn't break cycles to pause at the edge. You didn't get clarity to stay comfortable. This is your execution season. So ask yourself honestly, what step have I delayed? What obedience have I postponed? And what instruction am I sitting on? Because whatever you keep postponing, you are quietly allowing to expire. So let me make this real for a moment. Cycle breakers, when you talk about postponing obedience, we're not always talking about something dramatic. Sometimes it's the small things that God has been nudging you to do that keep getting pushed to later. For some of you, what you're postponing might be starting the business, launching the ministry you keep talking about, writing the book that's been sitting in your spirit for years, or applying for the position you know you're qualified for, or going back to school or finishing the degree, setting boundaries in relationships that are draining you. So, listen, it's actually time for us to go. But I want to tell you that, you know, every time we keep pushing those things to later, something subtle begins to happen. Again, the urgency fades, the conviction weakens, and the courage gets quieter, not because God changed His mind, but because unused faith begins to expire. So let me say to you all tonight, just because faith is parent in your head, if it stays there and never is executed upon, it's going to die there. And you were created to move, to build and live and not to expire. So don't spiritualize the delay. Don't overthink the movement, but it's time to shift. You hear me? It's time to shift. Good intentions without execution don't just delay you, they will drain you and they will steal your destiny. So you are destined for greatness, my friend. You are destined to be that person, maybe the first person in your family to graduate from college, maybe the first person in your family to start a business. It's not even about being the first, it's really about the satisfaction that comes from knowing that God spoke, you heard him, and you're executing what he said. So I want to encourage you tonight, be a winner, be a mover, be a shaker, and do what God is calling you to do. Execute that thing, execute that vision, execute that dream. Because if you don't, it's going to expire. And it's going to expire not because God changed his mind, but because you had faith, but you failed to move. So I hope that you got something from my session on tonight. I hope that it's inspired you, to get up and move. Do something about what God has placed in your hands. If he didn't think you could do it, he wouldn't have spoken in your spirit. So do it. Move, strive. Look, as I close, I want to invite you all to join me at 7:30 tomorrow evening on Coffee Conversations with Sandy here on Facebook. I'm going to make a post a little bit later or share her post. And I'm going to be talking about my new book release, The Other Side of Done. And I hope that you, as my cycle breaking tribe, that you will come on and support tomorrow as I talk about the book. And hopefully, if you haven't got your copy, that you'll go right over there to Amazon.com and you will type in The Other Side of Done or Cynthia Pfeiffer, and all my books are going to come up, but it's on Amazon and you can get the book. And when you get the book, write a review because I want to know how it blessed you because I'm sure it's going to bless you. Listen, it's time to execute and it's time to go. All right. This is Pastor C, your breakthrough transformational coach, your sister and your friend. I'm on the sidelines of your journey and I'm cheering. Execute that vision, execute that dream because there is a place that God is calling you to, and that place is called success. So cheer often for your success. The devil knows your name, but the more you cheer, the more you're going to change this execution game. All right. This is Pastor C. God bless you. I'll be back here on Friday for your 5-minute reset, your Friday empowerment. And Lord willing, I'll be back on Monday with week 10 of our MMB Shift, Align, and Execute series. And don't forget to join me tomorrow night, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Coffee Conversations with Sandy, where she's going to be interviewing me about the book, The Other Side of Done. God bless you all. I love you. Take care. Bye-bye.